Have you ever wondered why Kentucky is called the bourbon capital of the world? Bourbon is synonymous with America, just like wine is synonymous with France. And just like wine, there are many regions throughout the United States where you can make it. So what makes Kentucky so special? Well, join us as we take a look at how Kentucky became the bourbon capital of the world. Now, if you know anything about whiskey or bourbon, then you probably already know that Kentucky is one of the best places to make it. Kentucky produces more than 95% of the world's bourbon supply and more than 70% of the world's rye whiskey. That is a lot of American whiskey coming out of the bluegrass state. But why? Why did it become the dominant producer of this spirit? Well, there are many theories, but they all boil down to three: natural resources, immigrant settlers, and last but not least, politics. Let's start with the first one. So let us start with what most people think is the main reason Kentucky became the bourbon capital of the world. This is because of Kentucky's natural resources. Bourbon, much like wine, gets a lot of its characteristics from its natural environment. You see, when making bourbon, you need three main ingredients: water, corn, and of course, yeast. Now, these ingredients have to come from somewhere, and Kentucky has them in spades. First, let's talk about the water. See, when making bourbon, the quality of the water is very important because it is used in every single step of the process and will affect the final product in big ways. Bourbon must be made from at least 51% corn, and so naturally, having an abundance of corn would help. Lucky for the early settlers, Kentucky had plenty. But you also need limestone in your water to filter out impurities. Now, Kentucky's underground water is full of it. You see, back in the day, the only way to make bourbon was to use limestone-filtered water because that is just what was available. And thank goodness it's in the state of Kentucky because it gives the bourbon a distinct flavor. And speaking of limestone, limestone-filtered water also creates a natural alkalinity that's perfect for the mash bill, which is the mixture of grains used in the whiskey making process. Water is also used to cut the grain mash after cooking and during fermentation. Because of this, you need soft water that won't react negatively with the mash. The hard water will produce a cloudy mash, which means you won't get the right consistency for fermentation. And it is no accident that most of Kentucky's distilleries are located near rivers and streams that have limestone in them. For example, Woodford Reserve uses the nearby Kentucky River, and Buffalo Trace uses the Kentucky River as well, along with several springs on site. And that is good because you gonna need a ton of it when you making whiskey. Speaking of making whiskey, most distilleries also use the leftover limestone rock from the filtration process to build their rick houses. Some people even say that the air in Kentucky is perfect for making whiskey. That is because the bluegrass state is perfectly situated in the transition zone between the northern and southern climates, meaning the weather varies from season to season. This is great for aging whiskey because it causes the whiskey to expand and contract as the temperatures change. This constant movement helps to smooth the whiskey and allow the flavors to meld together. Not only that, but Kentucky's climate and terrain are ideal for growing the right kind of corn. Corn is the primary ingredient in bourbon, so having access to high-quality corn is essential. Kentucky's fertile soil and warm climate create the perfect conditions for growing sweet and juicy corn that gives bourbon its distinct flavor and mouthfeel. But all that doesn't mean much without people to turn those resources into bourbon. And that brings us to our next point. Now, Kentucky is known as the bourbon capital of the world, but it wasn't always that way. It actually started out as a part of Virginia. And when it split off from Virginia, it didn't have any distilleries in it at all. But that changed when immigrants brought over their knowledge of distillation and the skills needed to make fine whiskey. Much like Scotch, the earliest settlers in Kentucky were Scots, Irish, and Germans, and they brought their knowledge of distillation with them. They were the ones who taught the Native Americans how to make whiskey. In fact, some historians believe that the first commercial distillery in Kentucky was built by a man named Elijah Craig. Now Craig was a minister, but before that he studied to become a cooper, which is a barrel maker. He learned how to make barrels for storing and aging whiskey while in Scotland and brought that knowledge to Kentucky, where he built the first documented distillery in the state. After him, more and more European immigrants came over to Kentucky and brought their knowledge of whiskey making with them. These new distillers experimented with different mash bills and aging techniques to develop a style of whiskey that would become known as bourbon. In particular, the Irish played a large role in perfecting the art of distilling in Kentucky. They brought with them a technique called pot still distillation, which involves distilling the mash bill twice. This helps to create a smoother, more refined spirit. Another thing that the Irish brought to Kentucky was their knowledge of malting. Malting is the process of sprouting barley and then drying it out. This creates an enzyme called amylase, which is used to convert the starches in the corn to fermentable sugars. Without malting, it would be difficult to ferment corn properly and produce a high-quality spirit. And of course, we can't forget about the African Americans who were brought to Kentucky under slavery and who were instrumental in the development of bourbon. Many of them were experts in distilling, and they worked in the distilleries owned by the white population. Some historians believe that African Americans may have been the ones who developed the sour mash technique, which involves using some of the mash from the previous day's distillation to inoculate the mash bill. This helps to create a consistent and reliable fermentation. The African Americans also may have been the ones who developed the practice of aging bourbon in charred oak barrels. This helps to create the distinctive color and flavor of bourbon. But even with all these skilled workers, Kentucky still needed something else to really become the bourbon capital of the world, and that was someone to promote the drink. And that brings us to our last point, politics. As mentioned earlier, Kentucky has plenty of limestone-filtered water and fertile land to grow corn, and it has a history of distilling going back to the days of the Scottish and Irish immigrants. But it took some help from politicians to really put Kentucky on the map when it comes to bourbon. One of the biggest advocates for the Kentucky bourbon industry was a man named Colonel H. Taylor Jr. He was a distiller, but he also served in the Kentucky legislature and was a director of the Kentucky Distillers Association. Colonel Taylor was a strong believer in the importance of bourbon to Kentucky's economy and culture. And he worked hard to promote the industry both inside and outside of the state. Now, one of his most famous acts was the founding of the Stitzel-Weller Distillery in 1870. This was one of the first distilleries in Kentucky to use modern technology such as steam power and continuous distillation. This helped to increase the efficiency of the distilling process and allowed for the production of higher quality spirits. However, not everyone was happy about this modernization. In fact, Colonel Taylor's efforts to modernize the bourbon industry created a rift between himself and other distillers in the state. Some saw the changes that he was proposing as a threat to the traditional way of making bourbon. But in the end, it was Colonel Taylor's vision and leadership that helped to transform the bourbon industry in Kentucky and set the stage for the state's future dominance in the production of bourbon. His work led to the creation of new jobs, boosted the economy, and helped to preserve the heritage of bourbon in Kentucky. But all that promotion wasn't enough. Someone had to come along and make it official, and that person was U.S. Representative John Y. Brown, Jr. of Kentucky. In 1964, he introduced a resolution to the U.S. Congress declaring bourbon to be a distinctive product of the United States. The resolution was passed unanimously and signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The resolution stated that bourbon is a product whose distinctive character and quality is due to the particular geographical location in which the corn is grown and the unique skills of the craftsmen who produce it. But it also said that bourbon is more than just a drink, it's a symbol of American culture and heritage. And this resolution was a testament to the hard work and dedication of generations of distillers, farmers, and other workers who have made bourbon the beloved spirit that it is today. Today, Kentucky is home to more than 90 distilleries and produces more than 95% of the world's supply of bourbon. So there you have it, the reason why Kentucky is the bourbon capital of the world. It's a perfect place to make bourbon. Natural resources like water and limestone. immigrant settlers who brought over their skills of distillation, and most importantly, politicians who advocated for the industry and helped to make it official. But it's not just about the resources and history. It's also about the people. The people of Kentucky are passionate about bourbon. They take pride in their distilling heritage, and they work hard to preserve it. Now, if you want to learn more about the history of bourbon, I highly recommend you visit the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. There are currently 175 members of the trail, and you can book a tour of any of them. And speaking of tours, go ahead and hit the like button if you enjoyed learning about how Kentucky became the bourbon capital of the world. Also, if you have the time, why don't you check out this video right here? It's about how Scotch became the national drink of Scotland. But I'll warn you, it's pretty sad. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember to enjoy responsibly. Cheers! Today we're taking a deep dive into what makes Kentucky the perfect place to age bourbon. So let's get into it. There are some basic principles at play here, so I'm gonna lay those out first and then show you how Kentucky hits every single one of them. The no. One thing you need for proper barrel aging is significant but moderate temperature swings throughout the year. Think about this: when the climate is consistently hot, the barrels will expand and contract predictably. When the temperature drops, the liquid inside the barrel shrinks, causing pressure against the barrel's staves, forcing the wood fibers to tighten up. Then when the heat returns, the liquid expands again, pressing outward and opening up the fibers. As this cycle repeats, the back and forth movement of the liquid within the barrel works the wood fibers like a massage, pushing the flavors and color from the charred oak deeper into the bourbon. In contrast, when the temperature swings are extreme, there is not enough time for the liquid to absorb the flavors from the wood or for the wood to fully expand and contract. In hot, dry climates, the higher temperatures can lead to excessive evaporation, altering the original ratios of the mash bill and weakening the final product. To cold, and the reverse happens. The expansion and contraction becomes restricted, preventing the bourbon from maturing properly. For example, a single year of aging in Tennessee can result in the loss of 50% of the whiskey due to cold weather, whereas in Kentucky that's unheard of. So now let's look at Kentucky's climate and see how it nails each of these points. First, Kentucky's location in the eastern part of North America and its position slightly north of the equator mean it experiences four distinct seasons with significant but moderate changes in temperature. Summers in Kentucky are hot and humid with average daily highs around 87 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. Winters can be cold with average lows near 23 degrees Fahrenheit or -5 degrees Celsius. These temperature variations ensure a good exchange of oxygen and moisture between the bourbon and the barrel without being too extreme. Second, the hot summers help with the initial extractive phase of the aging process. Higher temperatures increase the rate of diffusion, encouraging the bourbon's passage into the wood for the first 2 years. During this period, the internal temperature of the barrel must reach at least 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius for the aging process to begin. But a climate that is consistently too hot can lead to issues later in the aging cycle. Although Kentucky's summers are hot, the state's abundant forests and high canopy cover provide shade, keeping the temperatures moderate and avoiding the potentially damaging effects of direct, intense sunlight. It keeps the temperature from getting so high that it causes the wood to expand too rapidly or leads to excessive evaporation. Third, the colder winters slow down the aging process and prevent excessive evaporation. In contrast to the hot summers, the cold Kentucky winters slow down the extraction phase. This drop in temperature reduces the permeability of the wood, making it harder for the bourbon to move into the barrel. However, this change in seasons helps maintain the quality of the product over time. Here's why. The point at which the angels share, the amount of alcohol lost to evaporation, is no longer beneficial to the whiskey is called the critical point. Before reaching this point, the evaporation of alcohol actually improves the whiskey's flavor and strength by concentrating the remaining liquid. But when the ratio of water to alcohol is thrown off, the angel's share starts to negatively impact the quality of the bourbon. In general, the critical point occurs when the liquid in the barrel has approximately 50% alcohol by volume. When this happens, the evaporated portion of the liquid, which is mostly alcohol, no longer contributes positively to the final product. Instead, it reduces the strength and overall quality of the remaining whiskey. On top of that, the composition of the liquid evaporating off the surface of the bourbon is different from the liquid found beneath it. This means the Angel's share gradually changes the profile of the remaining liquid over time. Water naturally evaporates over time. And because water has a lower boiling point than alcohol, it disappears first, increasing the percentage of alcohol left behind. This gradual increase in alcohol concentration can be good, as mentioned before, but once the critical point is reached, it becomes detrimental to the quality of the final product. Now, when the temperature drops to freezing and stays that way for an extended period of time, the water in the barrel expands, putting pressure on the barrel and pushing liquid back into the barrel. This helps to make up for any shortfall created by evaporation, thus raising the water content and bringing the alcohol content down to the desired level. This natural replenishment is vital to maintain the balance of the bourbon and avoid the negative effects of the Angel's share becoming too aggressive. Fourth, the humidity of the Kentucky environment plays a crucial role in managing the Angel's share. Bourbon is stored in charred oak barrels, which have a porous surface. The pores allow water and alcohol vapors to pass through, contributing to both evaporation and the exchange of flavors between the liquid and the barrel. Moderate to high humidity, such as the roughly 65 to 85% seen in Kentucky, slows down the rate of water evaporation. This moderation of evaporation is essential. As we saw earlier, a small amount of evaporation is beneficial for concentrating the bourbon and enhancing its flavor. However, excessive evaporation can be detrimental. By slowing down the evaporation rate, high humidity helps preserve the original character and quality of the bourbon, ensuring it retains its full flavor and strength. Fifth, Kentucky's climate tends to avoid extremes, both hot and cold. As we already talked about, if the temperatures become too high, the high expansion and contraction can damage the barrels and lead to excessive evaporation, weakening the final product. Conversely, if the temperatures drop too low, the expansion and contraction slow down, restricting the bourbon's interaction with the wood and slowing down the aging process. But Kentucky's climate remains relatively mild, minimizing the risk of damage from both heat and cold. While there are occasional instances of extremely hot or cold weather, they are not consistent enough to pose a threat to the quality of the aging process. To summarize, the key elements of Kentucky's climate that make it ideal for bourbon aging are the following. 1. Significant but moderate seasonal temperature swings, which cause the wooden barrels to expand in the summer and contract in the winter. This helps push the flavors and colors from the charred oak deeper into the bourbon. 2. Hot summers that facilitate the initial extractive phase of the aging process, but not so hot that it leads to excessive evaporation or rapid barrel expansion. 3. Cold winters that slow down the aging process and prevent excessive evaporation. 4. Moderate to high humidity levels that slow down the rate of water evaporation, preserving the quality of the bourbon. And 5. A climate that generally avoids extremes, balancing the benefits of heat and cold to ensure a high-quality maturation process. All these elements work together to create the perfect environment for aging bourbon. And that's why Kentucky has earned its reputation as the birthplace of bourbon, and why nearly all the world's supply of bourbon is made right here in the Bluegrass State. Now, if you want to learn more about what makes Kentucky's climate so special, check out my video on the unique geographic features of the region. Or if you're interested in the science of aging, I've got a great video on that as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. In the past, fake news and misinformation ran rampant across newspapers. Yellow journalism, sensationalism, and biased reporting were common practices. In such an environment, it was difficult for consumers to discern the truth. However, there was one place where honesty and transparency were not just valued, but legally enforced. And that place was right here, right in our own backyard, the heart of Kentucky bourbon country. Welcome to this week's episode. Today we are diving into a topic that is near and dear to my heart, the history of the term bottled in bond. You know, I have always had a soft spot for old-timey laws and acts, things like the Mason-Dixon Line or the Sherman Antitrust Act. They represent significant moments in history that have shaped our world in profound ways. But for me, nothing quite matches the allure of the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. A piece of legislation that not only revolutionized the whiskey industry, but also laid the groundwork for consumer protection laws across the United States. Picture the year 1897. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and with it comes mass production and mass marketing. But here's the twist. During this era, the Wild West of whiskey was in full force. Anyone and everyone was producing whiskey, which led to a flood of low-quality, often adulterated or even counterfeit products hitting the market. And let us just say the term adulterated doesn't even begin to describe some of the things that were being done to these whiskeys. We're talking sawdust, plaster bones, and the bodies of small animals found floating in vats. That was the problem they were trying to solve. Enter the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, a beacon of reform in an ocean of deception. Enacted by Congress and signed into law by President William McKinley, this act was the first consumer protection legislation in the U.S. Its purpose, to distinguish genuine straight whiskey from the sea of poorly made and sometimes downright dangerous products flooding the market. The act established a federal standard of quality and authenticity. It was a bold move, a testament to the growing demand for transparency and reliability in an age of mass production. Now, you might be thinking, what does this all mean? Well, let me break it down for you. The Bottled in Bond Act set out for key requirements that any bottle of straight whiskey sold within the U.S. had to meet. First, the whiskey had to be distilled by one producer during a single distillation season, which was either from January to June or July to December. This ensured that each batch was consistent and could be traced back to its source. Second, the whiskey had to be aged in a federally bonded warehouse for at least 4 years. This provided a guarantee of quality and maturity. Third, the whiskey had to be bottled at exactly 100 proof, 50% alcohol by volume. This standardized the strength of the whiskey and ensured that it was neither diluted nor overproof. And fourth, the whiskey could not contain any additives except water used to adjust the proof. This ensured that the whiskey was pure and free from any adulterants. But that's not all. The act also mandated that the bottles be labeled with the distillery and the location where it was bottled. This provided consumers with valuable information about the provenance of their purchase and allowed them to verify the authenticity of the product. These requirements may sound pretty standard today, but back in 1897, they were revolutionary. The act addressed a major concern of the time, the proliferation of adulterated and mislabeled whiskey. Consumers no longer had to be wary of what they purchased. If it was labeled as straight whiskey and met the requirements of the Bottled in Bond Act, then it was exactly what it was advertised to be. You see, prior to this act, the whiskey market was a murky and regulated space. Unscrupulous producers could easily mislabel their product or adulterate it with harmful substances. The result was a market rife with distrust. Consumers couldn't be sure what they were buying and producers were free to engage in deceptive practices, but the Bottled in Bond Act changed all of that. It ushered in an era of transparency and accountability in the whiskey industry. The impact of this act on the reputation of Kentucky bourbon was profound. By setting a high bar for quality and authenticity, the act helped to elevate bourbon's image from a rough and ready frontier spirit to a refined and respected American whiskey. The new law provided a level playing field for producers, rewarding those who met the high standards with the trust and loyalty of consumers. Those who chose to cut corners or compromise on quality were left behind. And let's not forget about the role of the Bottled in Bond label itself. Once a bottle bore this label, it became a symbol of reliability and excellence. Consumers knew that what they were getting was a pure, high-quality whiskey that had been produced and bottled under strict government supervision. This kind of trust is invaluable, and it is something that the whiskey industry has carried forward ever since. The benefits of the Bottled in Bond Act extended beyond just reputation. The act also provided distillers with a tax incentive for producing and holding bonded spirits. This helped to bolster the economy of the region and ensured a steady stream of revenue for distilleries. The act was a win-win situation. Consumers got a superior product, and distillers received greater economic stability. But the legacy of the Bottled in Bond Act goes far beyond the confines of the whiskey industry. In fact, it serves as a cornerstone of consumer protection laws across the United States. Before the act, there were very few regulations in place to protect consumers from misleading or harmful products. But the act demonstrated that such measures were not only necessary, but also highly effective. The success of the Bottled in Bond Act paved the way for similar regulations in other industries. The principles of transparency, accountability, and consumer safety became embedded in the American business landscape. Fast forward to today, and the impact of this act is still widely felt. The Bottled in Bond label remains a mark of quality that is respected by both consumers and bartenders alike. When someone opts for a Bottled in Bond bourbon, they know they're getting a whiskey that meets the highest standards of quality and authenticity. The legacy of the Bottled in Bond Act lives on in the continued popularity of this designation, as well as in the various state and federal laws that protect and regulate alcoholic beverages. So here's to the past, present, and future of the Bottled in Bond Act. May its principles of quality, transparency, and consumer protection continue to shape the whiskey industry and inspire confidence in consumers for generations to come. And remember, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Thanks for joining me this week on the Kentucky Bourbon Tour. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to join us next time for more stories and insights from the world of Kentucky bourbon. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and most importantly, stay informed.